Member for Fredericton West, Hanwell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's a pleasure to rise in the House today to discuss a matter that's always close to my heart, and that is the matter of taxation. And, Mr. Speaker, I always take these occasions to remind all of us that we have a couple of reasons that we're all in this legislature together. One of those reasons is, of course, to pass and review the laws that govern this province. But the other second, and I would say in many ways most important function, is to find out where the money is going and track that and make sure that there's some controls put on that. So, Mr. Speaker, it was with interest that I watched what unfolded today when the Minister of Finance rose in this chamber with a letter or a notice from the Lieutenant Governor. And we all know that's the procedure, Mr. Speaker, but much of what we do in this House is symbolic. But it behooves us to scratch a little bit below the surface of these procedures and symbols and understand what's really happening. And what happened today it illustrates why we're here. So the minister is empowered to bring to this chamber the requirements of the Lieutenant Governor for spending in the province. And that's because, Mr. Speaker, we have a number of branches of government in this province. We have the executive branch, and that's symbolized by the Lieutenant Governor, but it is in fact the government of New Brunswick and all of the operations that happen within that. And of course, out of this chamber is chosen a premier and a cabinet that then becomes the executive branch of government. And those members are still members of this branch, the legislative branch. So we have a fused system where the executive is actually represented in here, and through the process that we have in here, through question period, through debates in this House, they are actually now responsible in many ways to the legislative branch. But what happened today is the minister comes in with effectively a request from the Lieutenant Governor, from the state, from the government of New Brunswick for spending. In this case, it was the capital estimates. And what's happening through that process is the government is asking the legislative branch for money. Because it is the legislative branch, not the government, that controls the people's money. And it's a fundamental thing that we need to understand here, that it is the responsibility and the burden of the people in this chamber and nowhere else to scrutinize where the people's money is going and where it's coming from. That is one of our fundamental jobs. And that is why we have this pageantry, this ceremony that we had today, is because the executive has to ask the legislative branch for money. And there's a ceremony that goes around with it. But at the core of it is a reminder to all of us in here that it is us, the members of this legislature, that are elected here to track the people's money. And Mr. Speaker, that cuts immediately to the issue of taxation. Because as you know, every cent that's spent by the government of New Brunswick comes from the people of New Brunswick. There is no other source of revenue for the government. I mean, there are some royalties and that sort of thing, but it is a very small sliver on the budget, which is derived, and it comes from the pockets of the taxpayers of this province. And Mr. Speaker, it's important to know that the taxpayers of this province, some of them are rich and some of them are poor. In that bundle are working people, are executives, are single parents, are people that are struggling to make ends meet. All of those people contribute to the tax base of this province, Mr. Speaker. And we are responsible through our ridings to all of those people. And so it's always a pleasure to get up here and have a little bit of an intellectual debate. And the member opposite, sort of posed the question, how is it best that we stimulate the economy? Because we've heard a lot of rhetoric coming from the government about how this economy is going to be driven forward. And I'll tell you, I've said it before, Mr. Speaker, their messaging is great. It's bang on. When they give a speech, when the Premier stands up in here, I in my head sometimes I applaud, Mr. Speaker, because he's saying the right things. But the challenge that I find is when I contrast what he said with then the laws that he's bringing forward and the policies that he's put in place, there's a complete disconnect. On one hand, he's saying all the right things about growing the economy, about stimulating it, about building jobs in this province, about looking after families, and this government's just spent tens of thousands of taxpayers' dollars on sending out print media and television media and radio media to convince the people of New Brunswick that they're looking after those priorities. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is those are insincere platitudes. Those are not what this government is doing. And in fact, that's why the opposition has had to bring forward this motion. Now, we hear a lot of criticism from the government about the way the opposition conducts business, and the honourable member went into it a little bit in his most recent speech. But I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, we understand our job over here. And that our job is to make sure the government's on the right track, to do what we can to nudge and prod them, because at the end of the day, they're the government. They have the majority, and they're going to move forward on their policies as they see fit. But it's our job to shed heat and light on those policies, to question those policies, and make sure those policies are serving the interests of New Brunswickers. So, Mr. Speaker, if that comes across as criticism, so be it. If the members opposite can't take that constructive criticism and see it as negative, so be it. But it's our job to cast that heat and light on what they're doing and make sure the people of New Brunswick are as aware of as much of it as they possibly can be. So that's kind of the role of the opposition. And Mr. Speaker, I think we've offered some very positive statements. I think this resolution, in fact, offers some positive alternatives. But it certainly calls into question some of the reality of what this government is doing. So the member opposite in his speech sort of posed the question, how do we best stimulate the economy? Well, to me it comes down to kind of two schools of thought. And we have what could vaguely be seen in the modern day political environment to be the liberal school of thought. And lately that seems to go to the economic theory of people like John Maynard Keynes, who believe that in times of crisis, the government can spend a lot of money and somehow stimulate the economy to move it forward. And that's the thinking that we've heard a lot from the government. This government was elected on over $1 billion in promised spending for infrastructure based on this economic theory that somehow the government can tax enough money and spend enough money to stimulate the economy. So that's one idea, Mr. Speaker. Like I say, that's the idea that's espoused by parties of a liberal stripe around the world now. And I'll tell you, I believe that model has been largely discredited. I think it's part of the reason that we're so slow out of the gate on economic recovery, because, Mr. Speaker, I don't believe it works. I do not believe the principle that the key to success is taxing the people and then spending their money. That is not the way to grow the economy, Mr. Speaker. In fact, there is another alternative model out there. And that's the model that was proposed as early as people like economists like Adam Smith. And that is a truly free market is what drives the economy forward. That there's an invisible hand at work. That through the confrontational and conflict-ridden process of the free market and entrepreneurism, which is a difficult process, that process of competition and free market will produce the best results for the economy. And we've seen controlled economies. Obviously communist countries are heavily controlled economies, and we've seen where they end up. You don't need to look any further than the fall of the Soviet Union to find that those principles of command economies, controlled economies that derive their welfare from taking money from the people and giving it to a government that somehow knows better than the people how that money will be spent. So there's all kinds of examples of where this has failed, Mr. Speaker. And also we look to our own economy. And I would suggest to you in markets that where competition is present, where there's a limit of regulation that's there to protect some cases, but the majority of the market is free and open, those are the markets that prosper the best, Mr. Speaker. And so it comes to the issue of taxation. Now, it's amazing to me this government now has one of their policies that they are actually going to reduce taxes. Now, I say that, Mr. Speaker, because I love that phrase, reduce taxes. It's a great word. It's a great phrase. I love to hear it even out of the mouths of the government, especially out of the mouths of the government. But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is they're now proposing to reduce the taxes they increased not very long ago, only for the purpose of giving more taxation room to the federal government. This government that sits in front of us, this government that's been in office for just over a year, that has raised taxes on New Brunswickers to some of the highest rates in North America, now realizes that it has to reduce taxes. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not for the good of the taxpayer of New Brunswick. It is for the good of their federal partners. To give those partners that extra taxation room so the federal government can gouge the New Brunswick taxpayer. The New Brunswick taxpayer, as a result of the so-called tax decreases of this government, the New Brunswick taxpayer will not see a single extra cent in their pocket, because that room will be immediately sucked up by the federal government's tax grab.
Shame.
Mr. Speaker, it's not acceptable. The reality is that this government, the Gallant government, has pushed the New Brunswick taxpayer to the absolute brink. We are now on the brink of taxation collapse, Mr. Speaker. They cannot push the New Brunswick taxpayers any further. And they're going to do it. We've seen in the options document or the choices document that they're proposing to increase all kinds of fees and all kinds of taxes, Mr. Speaker. So they're going to push us a little further. But the reality is that they've realized that New Brunswick taxpayers are on that precipice. And so their solution to the problem is to back off their taxes just enough that the federal government can make up that gap and push the New Brunswick taxpayer back to the brink. If they thought they could tax people more, they'd be doing it. If they thought they could tax people more, they wouldn't be reducing the taxes. But the reality is they've realized that through their own policies, New Brunswick taxpayers are now at that point, that they simply can't gouge those taxpayers any longer. There's no room left. And so they have to give up some of that room because the feds are going to do it anyway. Mr. Speaker, it's a very unacceptable position. And that is why this opposition is bringing forward this motion. Because this government needs to be reminded that you cannot just keep taxing the taxpayer of New Brunswick. They're at the breaking point. And as I've said, with the choices document, we're looking at a 2% increase on the HST. Now, Mr. Speaker, one of the first things I did when I got to this legislature, as the member for Fredericton West Hanwell, was caution this government about the potential of raising the HST. And on every occasion when I've got up in this legislature, I've taken that opportunity to remind this government that they should not be raising HST. And sure enough, the Minister of Finance and other members of the government, other members of this executive branch, assured us that they weren't going to raise the HST. And I can go back and answer it, I'm sure, and find those quotes from the Minister of Finance and the Premier and other key members of the executive branch that no, we're not going to raise the HST. Because, Mr. Speaker, we talked about this. When they repealed the Taxpayers Protection Act, we talked about this. Yeah. When they repealed the Fiscal Accountability and Transparency Act, we talked about this, Mr. Speaker. We've talked about it before. And every time the answer was, no, we're not going to raise the HST. And yet here we are, only less than a year later, with the choices document in front of us, and guess what's front and center in there is the HST increase. Now, Mr. Speaker, I hope they don't do it. Like I say, I hope I'm wrong on this. But I've felt for a year that this government was headed directly in that direction.
Time.